Good afternoon, and welcome to our 131st step in our walking tour through the Bible. And this is going to be quite a quick little step through the rest of the first book of the Maccabees. Now, if you remember, Judas Maccabeus has just been killed by his enemies and Israel has been conquered. But luckily, something happens. He's got brothers. The first brother who takes over from him is acclaimed by his supporters, and that's Jonathan, who becomes the high priest because they're descended from one of the priestly families of Israel. Eventually, Jonathan is made high priest by the foreign rulers. And then, after Jonathan dies, he's murdered, then his brother Simon becomes high priest and eventually ethnarch, that is to say, independent rulers or client king of the emerging Jewish state. Now, what we see in these two periods is an emerging Jewish state because the Seleucid Empire is racked by civil war, by constant rival claimants to the throne, and because one rival king is being played off against another, the Jews are courted by either side, as they're such good fighters, and they're able eventually to establish their independence. In addition, they have got good foreign relations with Rome, believe it or not, and with Sparta, two great powers, although rather distant ones. Now, from where we start the reign of Jonathan, which is chapter 9, verse 23, through to the end of the book, it's almost entirely political. And it's very, very, very confusing. If you want to know who's who in the Seleucid Empire, and that's pretty much a difficult thing to know, there is a useful Wikipedia page, which is just search for Seleucid dynasty family tree, and you'll get a whole list of the Seleucid kings. And of course, we also have a little entry by no less a person, somebody called Ptolemy and somebody called Cleopatra. In other words, the Greek monarchs of Egypt also feature. This Cleopatra was Cleopatra Thea, and her father was Ptolemy VI. Altogether, there were 14 Ptolemies, and I think there were 7 Cleopatras. They're numbered for convenience. But it's terribly, terribly confusing when you have a dynasty where two things happen. One, everybody's called Ptolemy or Cleopatra, apart from a few people who are called Berenike. And secondly, everybody marries their sister. So it's very hard working out who's related to who. Rather, it's not that they're related, but just how, well, incestuously they're related to each other. Now, there's only one thing I find at all interesting about the first book of the Maccabees, the second part, which is never read in church as far as I can see. There's only one thing I find interesting, and I'll get to that. As you've probably guessed by now, I'm one of those people who's read War and Peace and who rather skim read the Battle of Borodino, the Battle of Austerlitz, and also the Battle of Schongraben. I much preferred the bits about Natasha's first ball and things like that. I preferred the peace. I got bored by the war. Most people are like that. Most of us find Tolstoy's war making, war description, quite stultifyingly boring because it's very hard to follow. Now, this section of the Book of Maccabees, the first book of Maccabees, is in fact blood-curdling military history, to use that good phrase again. And it becomes very, very tedious. And one of the things we realize is that the Seleucid Empire was constantly at war. It hardly had a moment's peace. Not only were all the Seleucid kings constantly putting down rebellions in their provinces, they were also fighting each other for the throne or fighting the Egyptians for the throne. And eventually they were fighting the Romans who put an end to their dynasty. Now, this is where it gets interesting. The eulogy, that means the praises of Simon the high priest and the ethnarch, it's found in chapter 14. There's a little poem about Simon the high priest and ethnarch, and it says this. So chapter 14, if you can find, well, I'll give you the whole poem. He sought the good of his nation. Well, that's good, isn't it? And they were well pleased with his authority. So he wasn't a tyrant, he ruled for the good of the nation. So he's a great guy, this Simon, rather unlike all these pagan kings. as with his magnificence throughout his life. To crown his titles to glory, he took Joppa and made it a harbour. Joppa and its harbour is still there. We call it Tel Aviv these days, Jaffa, where the oranges come from. Gaining access to the Mediterranean Isles. Don't forget the Jews had never been ocean-going people until then, because they lived in the highlands. They didn't have any harbours. He enlarged the frontiers of his nation, jolly good, keeping his mastery over the homeland, resettling a host of captives, bringing people back from exile. He conquered Gaza, Beth Zur, and the citadel. This was the stronghold that the pagans had set up inside Jerusalem, ridding them of every impurity. In other words, he got rid of the foreigners, he got rid of the lawbreakers, and no one could resist him. He won battles. The people farmed their land in peace. The land gave its produce, the trees of the plain their fruit. The elders sat at ease in the squares. All their talk was of their prosperity. The young men wore splendid armour. He kept the towns supplied with provisions and furnished with fortifications, until his fame resounded to the ends of the earth. He established peace in the land, and Israel knew great joy. Each man sat under his own vine and his own fig tree, and there was no one to make them afraid. No enemy was left in the land to fight them. The very kings of those times had been crushed. He encouraged the afflicted members of his people, suppressing every wicked man and renegade, in other words, dealing with the bad Jews, the Hellenists. He strove to observe the law. He gave new splendor to the temple, enriching it with many sacred vessels. Now, this is astonishing, this lovely little poem. This should be read out in church, I think. I've never heard it read out at Mass. This is a beautiful, beautiful poem. It's a eulogy of a man of peace. He's got rid of all the foreigners. He's conquered all these people. He's established peace. The whole point of war is so that you can have peace afterwards. And of course, peace is beautifully evoked. This idea you can sit under your own fig tree and your own vine and you're not afraid. And of course, peace means being able to grow your crops and to harvest your fruit trees. Rather, of course, war means that your crops are constantly being destroyed by marauding armies. This is a passage of great beauty, I think, marooned in the midst of the tedium of the first book of the Maccabees. Now, what this tells us, now let's go back a bit. Judas Maccabeus, Simon his brother, Jonathan his brother, were three charismatic rulers who rose up in Israel and led the people to military victory, also military defeat, it has to be said once or twice. But on the whole, they brought the nation to a newfound independence. They were charismatic leaders. They were, in a sense, messianic figures. Now, the Messiah, what sort of person is he? Is he a war leader like Judas Maccabeus? Or is he a man who brings about the reign of universal peace, as is the case with Simon? And this is, of course, his fame resounded to the ends of the earth. He established peace in the land, and Israel knew great joy. The Messiah, who is he going to be? A leader in war or a prince of peace? Now, if we look forward to the Gospels, which are only about 150 years ahead of this book of Maccabees, maybe 200 at most. The Gospels are about a charismatic Messiah, about Jesus Christ, our blessed Lord, the Messiah. And people can't really make up their mind about him. Is he a Judas Maccabeus figure who's going to drive out the foreigners and re-establish the kingdom of Israel and purify the land of foreigners and pollution and purify the temple and purify Jerusalem, which is incidentally all the things that Simon has done? Or is he going to be a man of peace who establishes peace? Or is he possibly going to be both? Now, if we read the Gospels, it's clear that they see that Jesus is a potential war leader, a Judas Maccabeus. Even though our blessed Lord in his personal demeanour was certainly not aggressive and certainly not warlike and had no military training whatsoever. Odd that, isn't it? They naturally thought this is the man who will lead us in battle. Or this is the man who will inspire us to rise up against our oppressors and lead us in battle, maybe. It's strange, but already in this little passage here, we have an indication of the true nature of leadership, of religious leadership, which is to lead people to peace, to lead people to contentment and joy, to lead people to prosperity and plenty. And of course, in the first line, we have the fundamental clue about this. He sought the good of his nation, and they were well pleased with his authority. Why were they well pleased with his authority? Because he exercised authority for the good of the nation. He was not out for what he could get, just like Antiochus Epiphanes and all the rest of them, and Cleopatra, Thea, and Ptolemy VI. He sought the good of the nation. And that, of course, is a beautiful little summing up of Catholic social teaching, what it has to say about the common good. Every decision that's taken is for the common good. Every decision that should be taken should be for the promotion of peace. This beautiful passage in chapter 14, I think, is almost like a charter of Catholic social teaching. It strikes me as very much like what the election manifestos must have been of the Christian Democrat Party in Italy in 1947, and indeed in Germany around about the same time. The idea of peace, prosperity, everybody sitting at home feeling happy, everybody leading a quiet life. So there we are. That is Christian democracy prefigured. All the very best. We'll be talking about the second book of the Maccabees very soon. All the best. Bye.